Today, I'm going to be taking a break from the normal video that I do to show you guys how I produce tracks so quickly. Something I don't really talk about a lot is the tracks that I normally do breakdowns of on the weekly YouTube stuff. I actually make those from scratch every single week, and that's on top of all the regular production clients that I have. I've developed my skills a lot as a producer, specifically in the area of speed, and I don't really see a lot of people talking about that, so I thought I would just do a video real quick to explain my process, and specifically the top 10 things I think most people should be focusing on if they want to develop their skills as a producer and just getting as fast as possible. So I'm going to sprinkle in some gear advice, but then I'm also going to be sprinkling in some mindset stuff, because I feel like if you have all of like the technical tools or the setup tools that I give you, but I don't address that side of it, is kind of not going to help you that much. So let's just jump into it. Number one, your desk setup. I'll take my phone and show some footage, but essentially my entire desk setup is made to be as practical as possible. I have a MIDI keyboard here so that there's very minimal distance that my hands have to travel whenever I need to come up with an idea. Like if I lock my elbows to the body and all I can do is rotate my forearms, I can kind of get in touch with everything I need. A couple other small things. I'm tracking a lot of guitars, so I actually have a 1/4-inch cable down here that goes directly into a DI box, which is how I prefer to track all of my electric guitars and basses. And the through of that DI box is actually going to a Boss TU tuner that's always on. So I never actually have to add like a tuner plugin inside of Ableton. And when you're tracking a lot of guitars like me, something like that really speeds up your workflow. The final thing that I have is this podcast boom arm with a pencil condenser on it. And I have this set up here on the other side of my desk so that whenever I want to record acoustic guitars, I can literally just grab this, pull it over, move it to the position I want it to be in, and I'm ready to go. And I've actually found myself tracking acoustic guitars a lot more often because of this guy. Because instead of having to have a mic stand set up all the time and move it and get up and do all this stuff, it's laid out very practically. So what I would do is start out with looking at the things that you are constantly doing with your setup and see if there's a way to make it a little bit more streamlined. So the first non-technical piece of advice I would say is don't stop when you are producing. It's really important that when you are in that initial creative state as a producer and you're chasing after that idea, like you have to almost be like a shark. Just don't stop moving. Like it's important to just keep running and keep doing something. When I was starting to force myself to do this, I actually got myself a physical timer and I set it for 30 minutes, and that helped me a lot. And it was originally inspired by this series that Fact Magazine did called Against the Clock, where they will give producers like Tom Misch 10 minutes to come up with a beat idea. At the end of that 10 minutes, they actually have something pretty nice. And that just comes from this almost improv, yes and process of producing music. Like, don't spend too much time evaluating if the idea is good or bad. Just be like, yes, and then yes, and then just follow your gut and follow your gut constantly. When you're at the very beginning of your production life cycle, that may need some time to develop. You just need to remind yourself that this is producing music. Nobody is going to die. So it's fine if the beat doesn't come out okay. 2 is learn practical keyboard shortcuts. Now, this is a slight difference between the normal advice of learning your keyboard shortcuts, like in Ableton, learning things like Control-Shift-X to delete extra space or Control-I to add extra bars in, really make a difference to your workflow. But what I see a lot of people doing is saying that you should learn all keyboard shortcuts, which I actually think is a bad idea. And here's the reason why. Depending on what kind of software you're using, not all the keyboard shortcuts in your DAW are actually going to be practical to you. Like in my opinion, there's not really a point to being Pro Tools certified or Ableton certified, because these apps are actually made to do a lot of different things for a lot of different people. So unless you are a professional live DJ who scores music to video, has a professional mastering job, plus like 5 other things, chances are you don't really need to know every single feature that your DAW has in order to do the things that you need to do. Like if you want to learn the shortcuts of your DAW, I would recommend looking up something like Best Pro Tools Shortcuts for Producers. And chances are you're going to get a lot more of a curated list on the things that are actually important for you to learn. So yeah, take the time to learn stuff, but don't feel like you need to learn every single thing. Another mindset tip that I would give to people who are starting to produce is work on multiple tracks at once. A lot of that picky editor side can come out when you only have one track that you're working on. And it can really be unhelpful for your development to get so fixated on this one track, when the lesson that you might need to learn about how to mix a snare drum or how to get an 808 to hit or how to find the right guitar tone, that lesson actually will probably come later on down the line once you do 5 more beats in this style. Also, working on multiple songs just gives you a chance to take a breather from a track. Most of the time when I'm making making something, I don't really feel like I have a good sense of whether it's good or not until after I come back to it at a later point. Like, I will be here, I will sit down, I will be creative, I will make it, and then I will sit on it for a couple of hours, go do something else unrelated to music, and then when I'm in a good headspace again, I'll come back to it and I'll analyze what I've done. And when you constantly have a revolving door of tracks that you're working on in that fashion, it becomes a lot easier for you to grow because A, you're giving yourself a break from the beat, but also you're not getting so hyper fixated on what is wrong with this beat. Because if the snare drum in one of your songs sucks, it doesn't feel as terrible as when you've made 5 beats and 3 of the snares in those beats are not okay, but 2 of them are pretty good. And that's how you learn. You can take notes on what you're doing good in some places and where you can grow in other places. Have all of your favorite plugins and samples organized. So unfortunately, I recently moved to PC and I didn't get to save all of the stuff that I had here before. But basically, this advice boils down to, out of your entire plugin library with all these different developers and all these different categories of sounds, it can be really useful to spend the time and go through the list and be like, what are like my favorite plugins that I'm always using, and organizing them into folders or some kind of preset structure so that you can always find them easily when you know what you're looking for. But for Blue, I used to have all of my weird creative sound design plugins, stuff that I was never really going to use in like a mixing session, but it would spur on my creativity, weird granular delays and things like that if I just wanted to destroy a sound and make it weird. But then in a separate category, I would have plugins specifically for mixing. So like this Bark of Dog plugin, which is like the voice of God. Shout out to my boy Johnny for showing me this one. But this is essentially a plugin that I'm only ever using when I am mixing. And outside of that context, I'm almost never using it. So it can be worthwhile to go through all of your plugins and just organize them into categories so that when you are in that moment of creativity, it's super easy for you to find what you're looking for. And then you can do this exact same thing with samples, which brings me to the next point: downsize your sample library. A lot of you producers need to downsize your sample library and your plugin library. Like, the amount of producers that I've talked to who will buy a plugin and then a few weeks later they will forget that they even own it is like a staggering amount. I know a lot of producers tend to have shiny object syndrome. What's the new thing? What's the new toy? But the way that I tend to view like plugins and sounds and samples is almost like somebody who's like a plumber. Like, I do this professionally, and so I'm very utilitarian about the stuff that I have. Like, if I'm a plumber and I have a wrench, this wrench is going to do a lot for me. Maybe I could have another wrench that does a slightly different job, and then maybe a third one as a backup. But like, as a plumber, I don't need to be looking on the forums for every new wrench that comes out, because the chances are what I have right now is totally fine. If the wrench isn't working, then it should be replaced. But if you're going to replace something, replace it. Get rid of the old one, because if you're not happy using it, it's just junk lingering around. The next thing I would say is have a goal sonically when you are trying to produce something. There's this really cool video that I highly recommend everyone check out. I will link to it in the description. But he talks about how it's important for you to hear something in your head before you try to play it. And I'm using this as an example because what I feel like a lot of producers do wrong is that they're just adding stuff to reflexively add stuff to the beat, but they're not really being specific about how they're doing that. In other words, I'm adding a drum part because I feel like it's time to add a drum part, instead of, in my head, I hear this drum sound. Okay, I'm gonna commit to that drum sound and try to make it happen. Producing in this way can help you from chasing your tail a lot of the time, because generally I've found that when I take the time to collect my thoughts creatively, which can only take like a couple of seconds to just decide what in my head do I want to hear, and just sit there and focus on it for a second, I have at least 60 to 70% more clarity and confidence for the sound that I'm going to be adding next. And if you're having a hard time audiating what you want to hear in the beat, I would highly recommend spending some time listening to some reference songs, ideally stuff that you produce in the style of, and just focus on one musical element and just pay attention to how it sits in the mix. Because the more you focus on that element and what it sounds like, what its texture is like, the next time you are in a session and you feel like you need that sound, you'll be able to come back to it a lot quicker because you're more familiar with it. I already talked about streamlining repetitive tasks on the physical side, but I really think if you are able to, and your digital situation allows for it, I would really see if there's a way to streamline the digital side. Like, I use this Stream Deck from Elgato pretty much every single single day. And I've had a couple of people ask me how this works, so I will just explain it. All right, so right here I have MoTT, which is a plugin that I'm constantly using. So now if I'm selected on an audio track in Ableton and I hit the button, it adds it to that chain. Again, not everybody is going to have access to something like this based off of how your DAW handles plugins and things like that. But I think that it's really useful if you can find a way to use it, whether it's bringing up a folder of samples that you're constantly using, applying a preset chain to a sound. But yeah, it makes things like lightning fast. The next thing that is important to becoming fast at producing is getting your hours in. Malcolm Gladwell in the book Outliers talks about how when the Beatles arrived in America at the Ed Sullivan Show, by that point, they had already spent 10,000 hours playing on stages as a band. Like they had years of gigging experience where they would go to a gig in Hamburg, Germany, and they would just play in a bar nonstop for 8 hours. And that kind of development doesn't really happen outside of those hours spent doing the thing. So I would say if you're really passionate about becoming a producer, spend the time producing. Because on some level, every other piece of advice that people give you about producing is going to be pointless if you're not actually spending time producing. Like if you are watching more YouTube videos or TikToks about how to produce music than you are actually producing music, you're kind of holding yourself back, which is funny to say considering that's the majority of my channel. And a lot of people are like, well, 10,000 hours, that sounds like a big amount of work to do to get to that point, which brings me to the last point. Just have fun. Honestly, like music production for me has been such a life-giving thing because it's genuinely something I enjoy. Like I am now starting to get back into video games for the first time in like 12 years because for the longest time, this has been my video game. Whenever I was in college and I had free time, the relaxing activity that I did was create beats or sit on the couch and write a song. I know that for people who are just stepping into this world, it feels very intimidating and scary because there's a lot of things to learn. But what I can say is that if you can have fun with it, you will become unstoppable. Because the second you start having fun with stuff like this is where it's easy to have those 10,000 hours just naturally fall in place. Like by the time I learned about the concept of 10,000 hours, I had already spent my 10,000 hours in the DAW just because I liked producing music in it. And over my creative life, that has served me well. But yeah, I thought I would just do this video real quick. I didn't have time to make a beat this week, but I just wanted to say thank you for everybody who's been subscribing to this channel. Like 3 years ago, it was a pain to get past 20 subscribers. So yeah, I thought I would just do this video and just talk about my side of the screen for a little bit. But yeah, moving next week, we will go back to those how to create the song in this style video. But yeah, hope you guys have a great week. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe. And yeah, I will see you guys next week.